adopted. We had 5 daughters, and so we adopted 2 sons. I never wanted to be just a mother and just a housewife, but I was pretty well trapped by my circumstances. But I always took time to go take classes and go listen to lectures and do things that got me out of the house and at least gave me some, view of the world outside of my very narrow life within the Mormon Church. I did have the opportunity as a Mormon to have a lot of leadership positions in the church that are given to women. There are a lot of auxiliaries in the church that are run by the women, particularly the children's and the teenage groups. And I was several times over the years president of those auxiliaries, and I do credit, a lot of the leadership skills that I learned and a lot of opportunity to speak publicly and so forth to those experiences. Within the Mormon Church, the women are called to do a great deal of the work to keep the organization running, but the women basically have no autonomy in the leadership that they're given. Everything that you do has to be approved by someone who's a man, who is in authority over you, and they can at any time take decisions that you've made. At the time, of course, I prayed about those decisions and felt I was inspired to have certain decisions about the organizations that I helped run. And if the leader above me, the male leader above me, did not agree with those decisions didn't happen. So that is the difference within this church, maybe as opposed to others. I've never really attended another church, but I, paid attention enough to know that there's a lot more autonomy for the things that women do in other churches on most occasions. I was a full tithe payer all those years. The Mormon Church requires that you pay 10% of your income to the church. Some people interpret that as 10% on your gross income, and some people on their net, and the church really doesn't tell you which. There is an implied doctrine feeling that if you're really faithful, if you're really obedient, and you really want the blessings, you will pay it on your gross and not on your net. It's not an official doctrine, but I can't tell you how many times, my husband and I agonized over, are we paying enough? And it's a huge hit for people financially. And some of you may know that the Mormon Church is, one of the wealthiest organizations in America. And more about that later. Over the years, I'd always been, I guess what my parents would call an independent cuss growing up. And even in high school, I can remember kind of kicking against the pricks. I was always the one who didn't like silly rules, dumb rules. I didn't like gender inequality. I always kicked against that. And, I was a feminist long before the term was ever coined or that I ever knew what it meant or what I was. But that was always in me. And so being raised and being a devout member of this particular church, it was not an easy thing to be. And as the years went on, and my kids were getting older, and I was getting more kind of politically aware, and the ERA amendment was being talked about and all that. The church got very involved in fighting against that amendment. And in fact, the church was very, very instrumental in the fact that it never passed, because they loaded up the meetings. And when they had the big convention in Houston, I believe it was, I was still kind of, not paying that much attention at the time, but it was packed with Mormon women who had been asked by their leaders to go and protest the amendment. And so that kind of woke me up, and I started kind of getting in trouble at church for some of the things that I said and some of the things that I pushed for. I pushed for retreats for women and things that would allow women to kind of get outside the box a little bit. And as soon as I started doing that more publicly, I began to be marginalized at church in a sense, even though they still kind of asked me to do a lot of work. But it wasn't any work that had any power anymore, because I was the dangerous woman at church. And that went on for many years. In fact, I have to say about the last 10 years that I was in the church. I did suffer a lot of emotional abuse, I think, from a lot of people because, and lost female friends because I was more liberal. And my daughter who's here would tell you that, and she's told me that a lot of the things that I taught my children made them feel schizophrenic because I would challenge things at church. We'd come home and they'd hear me discussing with my husband things we didn't agree with. And they would come home from their religion classes that they went to every morning before high school and say, you know, brother so-and-so taught this, and you know, and I go, that's baloney, you know, and get out the scriptures and show them how, you know, it was just his interpretation, and you know, and yet I demanded that my children live a completely obedient Mormon life, living all the rules, and so I think our family just basically grew up kind of like a split. And at the present time, my daughter who's here today is my only child who has decided to leave the church, and she left 10 years before I did. So she had a very interesting and difficult journey also, being the only one out of the church, particularly their parents both still in. I will tell you ahead of time, I have been very ill this week with the flu and laryngitis, so I'm going to have to drink a lot of water to keep going. In fact, I wasn't sure I was going to get my voice back. By the time I was in my mid to late 30s, I was beginning to see a lot of cracks in the church, and I think I was beginning to crack myself. But I want to go back now to tell you the basic beginning story about Mormonism and how it began, because it is a very interesting story, and I have come to find that I think it is one of the most fascinating stories in American history, regardless of whether you believe it or not believe it. First of all, the official canonized version that the church puts out is a story that Joseph Smith, who is the founder of the church, wrote down. But he did not write it down until about 10 years after it supposedly happened. And research in recent years has shown that there are several versions of this story, but I'm going to give you the canonized, accepted Mormon version of how it all started. Joseph Smith's family was very poor. They lived in the kind of that frontier area of America in western New York, and he was a young boy. They were Bible reading people but didn't belong to any formal religion, had not really joined when he was a young boy. They kind of gone in and out of different churches. His father was never very religious. His mother and some of his sisters were. But according to the story, he began to puzzle about religion and didn't know which church to join. And so he went to the Bible and started studying, and in the Bible he found a scripture that told him if you needed to seek knowledge, you were to go to God. So he went out in the woods one day and he prayed to God about what church he needed to join. And he, according to his story, was overtaken by a black evil spirit that wrestled him to the ground. And in the middle of that experience, he began to see a light from heaven. And when he looked up, there were two personages standing above him. And they spoke to him, and they identified themselves as God the Father and Jesus Christ, his Son. And they proceeded to tell him that all churches were wrong, that none of them were God's church, and that he was to join none of them.